Well, it's that time to bring the Coffee Myth series to a close. We're going to do that with a sort of unpredictable conversation about the future of specialty coffee with our return guest from last week, Henry Wilson of Perfect Daily Grind. Is specialty coffee commercializing? In other words, is it going mainstream? It certainly is growing in popularity, but what about all the big, bad companies buying everything up? Are they so bad after all? This and more in this week's episode. Let's talk a little bit about commercialization of specialty coffee.
Well, this is really interesting. It's something that I'm thinking about a lot and kind of analyzing, because specialty is obviously paying a premium price for a product which is a higher quality at its core, and there are certain social and altruistic values attached to that. What happens when there's a lot of things which are special? Is it still special? Is it still specialty? Because obviously if all the specialty coffee becomes specialty, which is what we want, then is it specialty or is it just the standard mark? And what I mean by commercialization of specialty is that there are established prices for specialty coffees. So for example, if you have an 84 cupping score or an 85 and you come from a certain origin or a certain grade, there are established prices. So it's not as if it's a totally separate pricing structure which is independent of commercial. And also the price of a lot of specialty coffees is pegged on the C market. So you're looking at the price of the global commodities market of coffee and you're saying, okay, we're going to pay a differential or pay an additional price plus 10 or however much it must be. So it is intrinsically linked. And I think that that's something that we forget about and miss. But the commercialization of specialty is that as specialty becomes a larger industry and the specialty coffee becomes more mainstream, then we will see commercialization. And when I say commercialization, I mean it will be more linked to the way that coffee's been traditionally traded. And then I guess you could say commercialization, partly you could say is professionalization. And it's saying that it's going to be more organized in a much more structured way that changes its sort of essence, because it's no longer just an artisan movement, but is now having significant investment by venture capitalists across the world. Large coffee groups are now seeing opportunities within it. Large trading groups, multinationals, are now putting a stake in the specialty industry because they see that it's no longer a fringe movement, but is now an opportunity for significant economic growth. So I think that when I say commercialization especially, there's different factors. It's that we're moving away from just being the artisan sort of outsider movement to being something more mainstream. The fact that specialty coffee is intrinsically linked to commercial coffee, so the pricing structures are even linked to the C market price and also the general price. There is established prices for specialty coffees, generally speaking. And there's other parts to it as well, but I don't want to just talk for forever and bore you.
No, I don't think this is boring at all. I actually wanted to ask you, what do you think the play, you mentioned earlier that the supply of specialty is sort of underestimated. What do you think the supply of specialty coffee in the market, how is that affecting this commercialization? Or is it?
Well, obviously, if you have more of a product, the market becomes more competitive, and people are obviously forced to produce higher quality products to compete in that market, to meet market needs, or to differentiate, or just to compete on price. So often if we're going to have more and more supply of specialty coffee, the price will go down. And that's something that's just kind of inevitable. And I think that if we're really going to look at it, it's quite fascinating. So we look at the supply of specialty coffee and we talk about how it is diminishing. And I'm sure it is, but then we're also seeing the emergence of new origins. So SCA last year, China was the portrait country, and that's a relatively new emerging origin in terms of Arabica production. We're seeing Laos, we're seeing Vietnam increase their production of coffee. We are seeing like a reduction in a lot of origins, climate change and such, but it's not quite that simple. And also we're seeing Brazil, which is highly efficient in the manner in which it produces commercial coffee, now realizing that there's a real economic incentive to move to specialty, and they're doing so. And a lot of the time they're doing it brilliantly. And then on the consumption side, okay, we are seeing consumers drinking more and more coffee. Fair enough. Like I didn't drink great coffee before. My friends didn't, my mum didn't, my parents didn't, everyone. But at the same time, we are becoming more efficient in how we're drinking coffee. So the equipment is getting increasingly precise. So it's no longer just one espresso being 20 grams, another one being 16, another one being 18. We're consistently having the high quality in terms of the exact dose. So we're being much more efficient. There's less waste. And then also you can't deny a lot of people are drinking different types of coffee. So for example, the capsules, they are composed of lower volumes of coffee. So in a capsule, you're looking at say under 10 grams of coffee, for a double espresso. And for a typical double espresso cafe, you might be looking at 18. And it seems like a small thing, but in the context of the global coffee industry and consumption, if you compare it, then you've got to see that, well, there is an increased supply, and it could say that there is an increased demand as well. Of course there is, but it's not quite that simple. It's not like we're now producing half a cup less and the consumer's drinking 1 cup more. There's a lot of nuances in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then what a lot of people keep telling me, and I hear this year, is that, oh, Henry, well, China's going to be the solution. China's going to just drink a phenomenal quantity of coffee and it'll all be okay. And a part of me feels like it's a little bit short-sighted because it's relying on something which may or may not happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, how are US and China trade relations?
Right.
I've been pretty excited the last few months actually being in Europe and looking at just the expansion of specialty coffee in Europe and all of these emerging countries which I hadn't really thought of, Eastern European countries, Southern European countries, which all of a sudden drinking a lot of specialty coffee.
Mm.
And that's where I'm deciding that I'm going to try and spend more time over the next year because I'm like, wow, all of these countries are now growing. Like I was invited this year to the Slovenian Coffee Festival,
Wow.
to the Croatian Coffee Festival, for the Austrian Coffee Festival, the Italian, the German, popping up everywhere.
Yeah, you're going to run out of probably time to hit all those, I'm imagining, Henry. I don't know if you can do the 200-day sprint you did this year and hit all
There's
of
always
them.
time. There's always time. There might be some actual work soon, but just travel around.
I think this is a really interesting topic because the whole idea of, on the consumer side, more people are drinking higher quality coffee. And it's funny you mentioned your family members and the people close to you. And I'm thinking of even the people close to me and how 4 years ago, which it's not really that long ago, but some of my family members would make fun of me because of how serious I was about a better tasting cup of coffee. And, you fast forward to today and they're like, hey, what are you bringing, when you're in town for Christmas? Like, are you bringing anything good? And now this, like I see it even in the immediate surrounding in my own life of these people who I thought would never drink anything other than, insert generic brand here. And they're demanding better coffee. And I think that that's a really intriguing topic and we're going to have to watch it unravel. I don't think we could possibly cover all of it today. I think it's interesting that China's being put out front as a solution to some of the issues we're going to be facing. But Henry, in your position with Perfect Daily Grind and commercialization, what are you seeing as far as brands, and I mean big brands embracing or starting to pursue specialty coffee in the market? Are you seeing that? Is it a big move? Is it a small move? What kinds of things are you seeing from your perspective?
There's undoubtedly being a movement where big brands, I guess by that you mean like conglomerates and multinationals.
Yes.
They're becoming increasingly involved in the specialty coffee industry because they see value and they see it as profitable investment. And then the other part is that they want to have market share. So I think everyone's aware of, say, Nestle purchasing Blue Bottle. Mm-hmm. People are aware of JB Holding Company with Intelligentsia Stumptown. It's undoubtable that we're seeing these movements, but I don't think it's necessarily as simple as seeing that, like, okay, Blue Bottle and Stumptown and Pete's or Intelligentsia are wildly profitable, so we're going to purchase them. I also think that these groups are looking to have market share. So they have presence of the whole coffee supply chain, often beyond coffee, beverages, and they want to be associated and be working with closely or owning the leaders in every stage of that. Right.
So, and just for all of our listeners to understand, is that kind of like diversifying your portfolio? Is that a similar kind of, I guess, goal to reduce risk, or how does that play out?
I'm not an expert in this, but let's look at JAB, for example. So they own Pete's, they own Keurig, they own Jimmy Choo, they own Stumptown, Keurig Dr. Pepper, Einstein Bros Bagels, Dow Egberts. And when you're having ownership over several different actors along the supply chain, several different leaders, what you're able to do is have a degree of control over the market. And I think that's what it really comes down to. And I can't really go into much information, much details, because to be perfectly honest, I don't understand the nuances. But I think that is not as simple as a lot of people thinking that a lot of these specialty coffee roasters are wildly profitable and therefore they're buying them. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. So it's about looking to the future and thinking, well, where's the industry going to be in 10 years? Okay, well, let's associate ourselves with these leading brands. And I think some people might think that, okay, well, if all these roasters are now being bought, this means that tons of people are making loads of money and they're doing something different to everyone else. They might be, but in my opinion, I think that it's a lot more complex than that. And the strategies in terms of these holding companies, these conglomerates, and how they structure it is not purely profit motivated in the short term. Well, I mean, so for example, in the UK, we have a leading chain, the equivalent of Starbucks, called Pret a Manger, and they have over 500 shops, I believe, or something like that. AB recently purchased them. And so they now have significant market share in the United States, across Europe. So it's really about kind of having kind of a subsidiary or having an active role everywhere. And I think also another key thing to note is that when you start looking at the specialty coffee industry, is that it's not immune to these groups. So a lot of players rely on the financing of larger groups and multinationals to exist. So it's not as if we're completely separate and we're just specialty and we do our own thing and we're completely separate from all commercial and large multinationals. A lot of the time, the multinationals are directly involved within the specialty coffee industry, whether they're being exporters, importers, traders, offering financing. They're involved in some way or another a lot of the time. And often they're necessary.
I'm going to press in a little bit here because I think this is a misunderstood part of coffee, and particularly from the specialty perspective. Let's go a little deeper here. You said they're apart. So even though these big companies who maybe they don't even own any specialty fronts yet in market share and what have you, how are they playing a role in supporting the specialty coffee sector?
There's different ways in which you can approach it. So currently, a lot of these multinationals, they have a direct ownership and equity in some of the specialty brands, I'm sure. I'd be surprised if they didn't. And they're financing their operations and they're basically enabling them to do what they do, and particularly to enable the fast growth. I mean, it's interconnected. So a lot of people might say that, I don't know, that Caribou Coffee or Peet's isn't specialty, it's commercial. But I mean, if you're looking at really the specialty grade of coffee, predominantly it is specialty grade as an industry norm, and they're purchasing large volumes of coffee. And the volumes which they're purchasing has a significant impact. And you could say that, okay, well, it's just commercial coffee, but the price of commercial coffee directly impacts the price of specialty coffee. Right. So it's all interconnected. So it's not like you could just separate it. And that's what I was saying, especially we have to look at the whole supply chain and think of like, okay, we've got all these actors, and what is everyone's role? Because it's definitely not as simple as just saying, well, I'm going to pick and choose, and this is how it's going to be. Mm-hmm. Because multinationals, holding groups, they're providing often a value-added service in terms of financing. And there are some groups which are extractive, which might not be contributing value in the long term. But it all depends on how you look at it.
I mean, big picture again, though, I feel like we're back to sort of what we said before, and sort of to round it all out. When you say we need to look at the supply chain as a whole, you're not even just talking about from seed to cup in the specialty sector. You're talking about from seed to cup in every sector of coffee.
Yeah. And I mean, it all comes down to where does the money come from and who's paying for it. Fundamentally, like if you go to a producer, they're going to say, well, who's going to pay for the coffee? I'll do it if they pay for it. If you go to a roaster, they'll say, look, I'll get this amazing coffee if someone pays for it. And you go to a cafe and they'll say, look, I'll do it if someone pays for it. Right. It all comes down to financing a lot in the coffee industry. And we like to kind of kid ourselves and think we're independent of that. But a large part is connected to that. I mean, I think about it a lot, and I by no means have the answers. And I don't really feel qualified to talk about a lot of these things, because these are just sort of the thoughts and impressions that I've gathered, which do seem to change quite often as I get more and more information and speak to different people. But one thing is that you begin to appreciate that it's really not that simple. And it's certainly not as simple as just paying a little bit more for coffee, for example. It comes down to payment terms. Okay, if you're going to pay that farmer, say 10% more, when are you going to pay them? It's like if I said to you, Jesse, say we went out for drinking and then you said, I said, look, I'll pay you $110 for the $100 I owe you, but I'll pay you next year. You say, no, mate, just pay me $100 now. You say, no, but I'll pay you next year $110. And that's sometimes what happens with specialty, is that we're paying market premiums, but we're withholding the payment terms. We're stretching those payment terms. Ugh. So then it's like, well, are we paying more? Or are you therefore, if I pay you next year, are you subsidizing my drinking then? Because I could have interest on money and then be paying for it through that. And when you start looking at it like that, kind of the perception that you have changes.
Right. You know, this kind of ties back to what we said earlier about price. If it looks cheap, there's probably a reason it's cheap. Like there's some investigation that should be done. And on the same kind of note, if an argument seems simple, if your understanding of something seems simple, then you probably should press in a little harder and see what nuanced things are going on that you're not seeing. That's kind of the message I'm getting here.
Yeah, and it's like another thing is that we can't obligate the consumer and obligate people to care. And I think that's one of our main issues that we have in the specialty coffee industry. And I'm certainly a culprit. I mean, we have Perfect Daily Grind. And when I first started, I started to try to force it upon people. So I'd like sit down with my friends and say, look, guys, I'm going to drink some coffee, okay? This is Ecuadorian, this is Ethiopian, this is Kenyan. No, don't touch them. I haven't finished my presentation yet. I'm going to tell you about all of the different processing, the flavors, and then you're all going to react and say how wonderful it is. And you know what I mean? And then as you progress, you think, well, I don't care if they like it or not. I like it. And then, like you said, like earlier on, then your friends come back to you, and then they actually do start genuinely appreciating it. But it's about giving people time to find their own path. And I feel like so often, especially coffee, we're kind of guilty of forcing and imposing our likes, because we shouldn't look at, say, a Frappuccino and be like, oh, it's disgusting. I can't allow that. It's appalling. We could think, well, if you're serving a Frappuccino in a coffee shop and you're using coffee which the farmer's been paid a good price, that's fine. The farmer needs that, you know? So there's lots of things at play. Like, I think we need to kind of change our approach gradually, and I think we're doing it, but being less sort of elitist in our approach to specialty coffee. And I think the US is way ahead of Europe in that regard. Is that when I'm in the States, I go to a lot of places and I just get a great cup of coffee. The barista is very friendly. In Europe, we're still a little bit more immature, that people are somewhat empowered by their information. People like to kind of be part of the exclusive community of coffee. But I think that we need to continue to widen that up and really invite people. Because, I mean, Jesse, you know, you've been there with your friends when you've tried to walk them through a tasting, and then you've realized they're actually laughing at you while you're doing it. It's happened to me. I mean, on Friday night, my friends had a Christmas dinner, and they said, look, Henry, we'd like you to come and do the coffee. And I got quite excited. I prepared lots of different coffee. And then I realized as I was doing it, they weren't mocking me, but they were sort of like humored at how much I cared about this. And I'm sure you've been there.
Oh, yes.
And you got, yes, he's going to make coffee now for the family, everyone. And then you make it and they're like, well, are you going to tell us about it? And you're like, are you serious with this? Or I don't know if you're subversively mocking me or.
Right.
But like, and I think that we need to kind of just let the consumer make their own decision, because it's becoming a lot easier to make good coffee as well, which is great.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's not so much like we have to give a friend a coffee and say that they have to get this grind setting and they have to use this device and set it all up. They can really actually make a great cup of coffee, and there's great brewers available to do that.
I love the nice personal touch here at the end of the conversation. I want to ask you kind of point blank, do you think commercialization of specialty coffee is a good thing?
Is this like a yes or no answer?
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be so simple. Remember? It might be nuanced.
It's like with anything. First, we have to define exactly what commercialization of specialty means, because we've talked about it a lot. We've kind of discussed multiple interpretations. But I think the more important thing is it is somewhat inevitable. So it's about appreciating what it is and learning how we can make best use of that system to retain the original values which are at the core of specialty. So I don't think we can just negate it and try and separate ourselves completely from it. We have to recognize that, okay, this is where the industry is going and what can we do? Because at the end of the day, like if I had a roastery and I was doing great stuff, and if I could grow it at scale and keep doing what I was doing and buy more coffee from my farmers who I started off with, say 10 years ago, buying small volumes with, then that's amazing. And that's what I would have wanted, you know? And so if we can, as it becomes increasingly popular, I don't really like the word commercial because it kind of doesn't have much meaning. And at its core, I don't really see commerce as a bad thing or business. I think that if we see that it's growing and that more and more people are drinking specialty coffee, isn't that what we really wanted? And sometimes I think when we take a step back and we look at it, we're like, oh, it used to be specialty. It used to be like for the artisans. It used to be for us. And now everyone's drinking it. But then if we look back at where we were when we started, that was the aim. We're like, man, I want to have a roastery where anyone can drink great coffee and enjoy it. But I think that some people in the industry might find it challenging because they kind of like the exclusiveness and being part of that exclusive community.
Right.
And as it grows, it widens. But I don't see it as a limitation. I see it as a positive thing. Now that I can talk about great coffee with a lot of people are interested. And it offers a lot of opportunities for people.
I think you have a wonderful point there. And it also seems to me that the ceiling, so to speak, of quality in coffee, or that sort of nicheness, that's not a word, but I'm making things up. That, you know, there's specialty, And now they're super specialty. And I don't want to throw a wrench in the conversation, but it does seem to me commercialization of specialty coffee is like a dream come true, especially if it's bringing with it the ideas about, well, the idea that we're talking about today, the whole equal risk factor that we discussed between the producer and the roaster.
Yeah, there's so many elements to it. And I guess you could say that as long as it's not extractive, as long as the producer isn't subsidizing that commercialization, then it's brilliant.
Exactly. I have some closing questions here for you. Not so much related to the topic at hand, but I want to know a little bit about what Perfect Daily Grind is doing. And then I have a few personal questions for you, Henry, to share with our listeners. So the first question I have is, can you tell us a little bit about the Producer Roasters Forum?
I'm glad you asked. So basically, around 2 years ago, I was talking with my colleagues. So the structure of Perfect Daily Grind is we have team members across the globe. So for example, we have team members in Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Mexico, across the globe. And basically, one of my colleagues in El Salvador, we were talking about how a lot of the best coffee events occur in consuming countries. So in Europe, in America, in Asia. And why can't we have an amazing coffee festival or amazing coffee forum in a producing country? I mean, he's from El Salvador. And we started talking and I looked over and I thought, this really isn't that difficult. And then we started looking at the costs of how we could do it. And then we started looking at, well, what do we think is missing from all of the other events that are occurring? Like, what are roasters looking for and what are producers looking for? So after now 2 years of doing the events, we did it once in El Salvador, once in Brazil. This year is now in Guatemala in May. And basically, the aim of this event is to facilitate a direct connection between roasters and coffee buyers. So cafe owners are also welcome, and the producer. So loosely how it works for international guests is that they arrive, I believe, on the 20th of May. They are picked up by their host, who's a producer. And what we do is currently we have around 50 international guests who have signed up. So they're from places like Australia, Bulgaria, UK, United States, Russia, Greece, across the world. And we make groups of roasters. So you have 5 roasters from, say, one from Greece, one from Australia, make a nice group of people, then another group of people, and then another group of people. And we put each group with a different coffee farmer or producer who we think suits their needs and who they got on well with. So basically, you arrive at the airport, your producer picks you up with your other colleagues that you'll be staying with. You then spend 2 days in the farms. You actually stay in the farms. You taste great coffees. You learn about processing methods. You spend time with the producer and learn about all the intricacies and all the wonderful things we've been talking about today and how things work, where are the opportunities. And then you can also share and exchange knowledge. We have a forum, which is in Ana Cafe. So that's the National Coffee Association of Guatemala. And we're working with Guatemalan coffees. And basically, we're going to have a 2-day forum where we're inviting 500 Central Americans. There's quite a lot of people. So we have producers, roasters, baristas, coffee professionals, exporters. And we're having lectures and presentations on European market, North American market, and all the major trends. Then simultaneously, we have an espresso bar, we have a brew bar. And then we also have, so for example, a roaster workshop happening the whole time. And we have cupping workshops and various sensory things. Lots of activities going on. That's the first day. And then in the second day, we have the world's first coffee blockchain auction in the morning, which is really exciting. And the principal reason why we chose to do this, so we're working alongside a great company called Yave, which is out of Seattle in the United States, was basically that we identified that we have a lot of people coming to these events in the last 2 years, but we really wanted to incentivize and encourage people to make a purchase of coffee. And then just create a platform separate from other auctions available to generate increased sales. So what we're doing is we're inviting all producers in Guatemala. So they have 125,000 producers in Guatemala. We're inviting any producer to submit a lot free of charge. It's then being cut by Guatemalan coffees and reviewing it, choosing the best lots, narrowing it down to 20 lots. We're aiming to have different processing methods, some honey, some natural, some experimental, some washed. We're then tasting those, and then after everyone's tasted them, we're having a round of auctions basically, and it's being conducted electronically. And one of the key things which is most exciting is obviously this coffee is blockchain. So the value of blockchain, and the reason why we chose it for this, is because so through Yave we can offer faster payment to producers, reduce the auction fees, and then also having totally transparent coffee. So a lot of people are talking about blockchain at the moment. There's a lot of hype surrounding it, but a lot of people in coffee industry don't really understand or appreciate the value it offers. So what we're able to do is we're able to make the supply chain from all the way from the farm to the cup, totally transparent, see how much every act has been paid, and also facilitate things such as smart contracts. So automate and centralize the buying process so it's more verifiable and more accountable. I could talk about that for a long time, but we're doing that. And then in the afternoon, after we have the blockchain auction, we have the latte art throwdown. But it's also worth noting that the key components of the event is bringing the producers and the roasters or the buyers together, or even the people that have a sincere interest in coffee together to facilitate that direct discussion in a coffee producing country. Because obviously a lot of producers can't afford to travel to the United States for a couple of days and walk around there, but they can afford to come to the capital city. And we want to facilitate and have an incredible event there. And we've got amazing partners. And I mean, we have, in my opinion, the world's best speakers coming. So we've managed to get an incredible layout of people attending and participating. And then with the blockchain, it's really something amazing because I really hope that we can generate a significant volume of sales for the producers. In fact, I'm very confident we're going to do so. And I mean, we could even just imagine if from one auction a day, we could facilitate $250,000 worth of sales.
I think it's an awesome idea. It's coming together really nicely, and it sounds like you have the key speakers already lined up. And I want to encourage our listeners to go check that out. We're going to provide a link that I'll get from Henry, and you can go read more about that if that interests you. Please do check that out. Henry, I want to ask you a few more questions here as our time's coming to an end. And my first question is sort of generic, but Henry, what resources would you recommend for our listeners, our podcast listeners? Are there any books, any websites? Obviously, Perfect Daily Grind is a must, but anything else that you would recommend for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much available. So there are a lot of great coffee publications out there besides Perfect Daily Grind. You've got Daily Coffee News, which is doing great work. You've got Sprudge, got printed publications as well that you can check out. There's podcasts. But I think nothing really replaces the direct connection and the direct conversations. So I would suggest to anyone here, go out of your way to speak to knowledgeable people because you'll learn a lot more. And also, if you have an interest in a particular part of the supply chain, pursue it. So to put it in context, I started Perfect Daily Grind because I had an interest in coffee and I had an intellectual curiosity of how the supply chain works and all the actors. And I just started reaching out to people, asking questions. And I was just a young guy, just really passionate, and people responded really well because they could see that I have a sincere interest. And that's what I suggest to people. If you want to know about things, then obviously don't waste people's time and ask tons of questions for no reason. But if you genuinely are fascinated, then just start talking to people. I mean, you could start with your barista, the cafe owner, the roaster, or it'll even be a case of contacting those farms via Instagram that you really admire and that you follow and telling them and seeing what response you get. Because the best thing that you can do is just speak to people on the phone and learn directly. No filter.
Well, Henry.
Hashtag no filter.
Yeah. Henry, thank you for joining us on the show. We're excited to have you. We tackled a lot of ground here. We'll be looking forward to listeners reaching out to us, asking any questions they might have, and we'll seek to find the answers as we can. So, Henry, thanks for joining us. Hope to have you again soon.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be here.
It was a pleasure having Henry on the show. I especially appreciate his humility in acknowledging he does not have all the answers. And in fact, he has noticed that a lot of the answers he finds in the coffee world lead to more questions, which in turn keeps the fulfillment of curiosity of this industry a moving target. As I said at the beginning of the episode, this is our final episode in the Coffee Myth series. That doesn't mean we covered all the coffee myths. Trust me, there are so many more I'd like to take on. But for now, we'll take a short break until we release a few spotlight episodes. So if you're up to speed on the podcast, thank you so much for your current support. If you're catching up this episode way in the future, thank you for your listening ears as well. If there's one thing we've learned from Henry in these last 2 episodes, it's that sharing the risk is key to a sustainable coffee chain. I hope that this podcast can help others to see that reality, to share in carrying the burden and the joy of coffee into the future. May that be the legacy future generations of coffee people get to enjoy. For now, thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.